Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being with us today and sharing what I think will be an extremely informative hour. We're going to be listening to forecasts on what was going to come and how the new world is going to be so different. We've started the year with great energy. There's lots of events already. I think we've got more than one a week over the next 5 weeks. So very, very busy from the Chamber's perspective. We're starting off with drinks this evening, so please join us for drinks at the Viva Bacchus restaurant. You can just arrive and pay at the door. And with all that energy, we are culminating this month with an event, the gala dinner held at Mansion House. So please, if you haven't booked already, there are still some tickets left. Give us a shout in that connection. But you're not here to listen to me, so thanks very much for being patient for the moment. I am Sharon Constanson. I'm chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce, and today I'm introducing, first of all, Alan Winde, the Premier of the Western Cape. And the reasons might seem a bit odd to you, but it's because of him that we actually have today's event. He talked in our launch of our Cape chapter in early December about this book and how he has ensured that everyone he ever speaks to has got wind of the book and gets to understand what the book is all about and how helpful it is to us in our day-to-day life. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Alan Winde, who will speak to you quickly from the Western Cape.
Alan Winde, Premier of the Western Cape here, and I must say that I was hugely influenced by Ian Goldin's book called Rescue. I think it's also really pertinent to what's happening in the world today. I mean, he spoke about, do we as a planet and people learn lessons when major events happen in our regions or across the planet? For example, the First World War, did we learn our lessons? It seemed not, because it didn't take long until we had a Second World War. But after the Second World War, we started to build democracies, United Nations, look for world peace, bring millions of people out of poverty. The world started to become a better place. But I think a few years ago, we started to see that tip again. And then COVID-19 hit us. And is COVID-19 going to be our First World War, or is it going to be our Second World War? Now, I'm determined in the province of the Western Cape and our government that we are going to make sure that COVID-19 and the lessons we learned from COVID-19 become our Second World War. So really it has influenced my State of the Province address. It has influenced our plans going forward, how we want to restructure government. We have in real terms less funding coming in, but and more demand, and we have the same government. So surely we should be re-looking at what government looks like and its ability to deliver on the demands and the growing demands of citizens. At the same time, we need to look at our economy differently, and I think this has given us that opportunity to learn about the innovations that we found, the speed to get things done during this pandemic, and how we delivered medicines to people's doors rather than them queuing in our clinics, and how we built hospitals, the biggest on the African continent, in 6 weeks, how we made sure that we never would run out of beds, or there were so many things, and they really got government to behave differently. And so how do we use the lessons of COVID-19 in our way forward to make sure that as a government we are creating better opportunities for jobs, for growth, for giving people that opportunity to live a far better life here in the southern tip of Africa. So definitely Prof. Goldin and his book had a huge influence on me. I've made sure that every head official in every department got a copy of that book, as well as each of my ministers. That was their reading over the December break. And that has definitely influenced how we think going forward. So I'm sorry I can't join you. It would have been amazing to be able to interact and discuss how we all across this planet make sure that we are building a better world. And especially now when we see what's happening between Russia and the Ukraine, and really human rights just going out the window, and invasions and war. I sincerely hope that we've moved beyond it. And how do we make sure that we do move beyond this? We find peace and we find a better world into the future. So sorry once again that I can't be with you, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much, Alan. Really appreciate your words. Very, very inspiring and interesting that Christmas reading involved from a global crisis to a better world. It is probably a bit of a rescue mission. I think the world is at risk of trying to have the new normal, as in the old normal. But it'll be interesting to see how and whether we have learned lessons as a global world, as a nation, as a company, and as a person, as to how much we are going to be different as a result of the pandemic we have been through. One of the things we have noticed is the acceptance and energy of ESG that has now reached our boardrooms in the UK and in South Africa, and we're finding that respectfulness towards the well-being of our people is far higher up the agenda than it's ever been before. So I already see some of the positives that come out of this. The rest of the webinar is going to be run by John Battersby. John Battersby is one of the founding members of the South African Chamber of Commerce here in the UK, been with us for ages and is now, due to tenure governance restrictions, is no longer on our board, but is on our advisory board and a very useful member of our team. He knows everybody that needs to be known. He was the man who is well known for being the first to shake Nelson Mandela's hand when he left prison. He will be in conversation with Professor Ian Goldin. Professor Ian, and I know him as Ian. Ian, welcome to our webinar today. Thank you very much for joining us. I have heard so much about your book. I am really looking forward to hearing it from you, because it's always so much more full and alive in that respect. So everybody, if you want to ask any questions, please place them in the Q&A, not in the chat. Put them in the Q&A function, and the team will pick up your questions and ensure they get posed to Ian during the latter part of the conversation. We'll be together for an hour in total. Thanks very much. And John, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and a very warm welcome to Professor Ian Goldin, who will be speaking to us in a moment. I'm just going to give a brief introduction. You will have his full introduction in your invitations, and as I say, welcome to everybody who has joined us, and we look forward to your participation and to hearing your questions, and to hopefully Professor Goldin answering your questions later in the session. So Professor Ian Goldin is the Professor of Globalization and Development at Oxford University. He was the founder of the Oxford Martin School, which brought together 300 academics from various disciplines to discuss, interact, research, and report on the major solutions to the major problems, the major challenges facing the world today. He is a former vice president of the World Bank, where he was director of development, and he was also before that he was the head of the Development Bank of Southern Africa and advisor to Nelson Mandela. He's the author of 23 books, all of them notable, but perhaps most notably the book he wrote in 2013, The Butterfly Effect, which is very relevant to our discussion today, predicted 9 years ago the pandemic which has changed all of our lives in the last 2 years. I'm going to now ask Professor Goldin to talk about his latest book, which is called Rescue: From Global Crisis to a Better World, and which deals with the pandemic. Ian, over to you to introduce your book.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for being the discussant today. And thanks very much to Sharon and the South African Chamber of Commerce for organizing this. Sharon's done an absolutely amazing job in building the South African Chamber of Commerce and initiating so many things. I had no idea that Premier Alan Winde was the source of my speaking today, but I thank him for his enthusiasm for the book, for taking it seriously, and for his very generous comments at the opening of this session. The reason I wrote it over the last year really, was because I am very concerned that we are not learning the lessons of these big crises that we face. And we're not getting, I feel, enough understanding of why they occur and how we stop them occurring in the future. Why are we in this dysfunctional world? As John mentioned, I did a book, The Butterfly Defect, which looks at why globalization is inherently unstable, why it leads to pandemics, which are inevitable, but also other crises, rising inequality, climate crises, and others. But that the benefits of globalization are so great that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and reverse that, but rather manage it much more effectively. And it can be done. We've succeeded in some areas, but we've dismally failed when it comes to others, including pandemics. Part of the motivation for writing it was the language that people have been using, the language of bouncing back or bouncing forward even, implying we're going to go back onto the same tracks that we had before the pandemic, but it's those tracks that are leading us over a cliff edge. That would inevitably mean more pandemics, escalating climate crises, growing inequality, and a rather dystopian world. Even some of the other language has disturbed me. The World Economic Forum uses reset. Let's use this as a reset. Well, when I reset, as we all do, operating systems of our computers, we go back to what was programmed in it. But it's that program which is the source of the malfunction. So that's not going to help us to reset to back to what we were. The Biden-Harris campaign had building back better as its buzzword or buzz phrase. But that too implies we're building back on the foundations we had. And when you build back on unstable foundations, you're guaranteed a collapse. So my hope is that we can think in more radical ways. We can take the lessons of history, as Alan mentioned, and really look very carefully at what they teach us about how we break out of cycles of crisis. How do we stop repetitive cycles? And how do we create a better world? And that's really what the book is. It's a very wide-ranging book. It's the timeliness of this webinar is that it's just come out in paperback in the last couple of weeks. And I haven't revised it in paperback because I found that the book and the publishers agreed that was published last September actually doesn't need to be changed. Of course, there's some new data, but the same trends are evident. And that's really what it's about. It covers many things. It covers the future of work, the future of cities, the future of offices, for those that are interested in that. It covers questions of inequality and why COVID-19 has led to growing inequality, what likely consequences are between countries, so a greater gap between rich and poor countries. The rich countries found $20 trillion for themselves in monetary and fiscal stimulus. Very little, less than 100 billion, so way under half of 1% has gone to development. In fact, many countries, including the UK, have cut development aid. The SDGs have been totally derailed. It covers those questions, and it also covers questions about the future of business and how this impacts on climate, on politics, on globalization, supply chains, and others. I didn't predict the Russian invasion of Ukraine in September last year, but I did point to a growing fractious world and the, I think, risk that Russia is becoming a rogue state. It's becoming a state which is not governed by global norms. And this builds on an argument I make in the book of how the pandemic gave way to a contesting of ideas. Fake news is one aspect of that, but we are now in a world where people understand and see things in very different ways. And of course, the anti-vax movement is another manifestation of that. So the book grapples with this question of how globalization has been distorted and how to think about the future of politics and power, and particularly the potential for a new coming together. Now, and some of the reviews of the book have referred to it as a very optimistic book. I think it is, because it sees the potential for the pandemic leading to a better world. The big question that I pose, as Alan referred to, is, are we in the First World War or the Second World War? Are we in a position where our leaders, our populations don't understand the depth of the crisis and the need for major structural changes, and so they tinker, they spend a lot of money, but they don't deal with the fundamentals, not least very high levels of unemployment and inequality, and the fundamental challenges to the global norms as well as trade. And that's, of course, what led, through the Great Depression, the rise of nationalism, etc. There was also a failure to write off debt from the First World War. And so massive, massive reparations and debt payments were part of the impoverishment of the losers in the First World War that led to the resentment. And I'm calling for a debt write-off. The Second World War, totally different story. But I don't attribute this simply to the leadership capabilities of Roosevelt and Churchill and others, although of course they were remarkable people who could juggle, as leaders today don't seem to be able to do, multiple balls, fighting a war, an existential battle, with the UK in real danger of being invaded, and yet at the same time empowering people like Keynes and others to create a new world order, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the Marshall Plan, the welfare state, all forged in the middle of the war, and a new world order. But what's remarkable is that Churchill, the war hero, who had delivered the UK from almost certain defeat, was deposed in the biggest landslide victory that Labour's ever known, 6 weeks after the end of the war, by a rather bland, unknown figure, Clem Attlee. And I've spent some time trying to understand this and what was going on, and how could it be that Churchill, who had done so much and was such a hero, could be pushed from power so brutally, so quickly. And the answer is that he didn't embrace this radical change. He was not prepared to embrace the fullness of the Beveridge report, which basically set out the pillars of the welfare state and the extent of change needed. And the population felt that this time had to be different, that they were not prepared to go into a cycle of repeated war, that they were not prepared to sacrifice their children again, and that they needed a guarantee of health, education, employment, etc. And so that was a landslide victory built on popular will against the media and others. And I take from that a lot of hope in democracies, that actually it's not about, and one cannot always kick the problem upstairs and say we don't just have the leaders that we like, but actually we all, as citizens, as businesses, as participants in society, have a responsibility for our futures. And that's certainly the lesson from them, which I take away there. The book's very wide-ranging. I don't want to take the whole time by covering more, but it just give you a hint as to the sorts of things that motivated me to do the book and that continue to inform the way I think about it.
Thanks very much, Ian. That was an excellent summary and given us a lot of food for thought in terms of our discussion going forward. I think this whole notion of, and I should start off by saying you are largely regarded as an optimist when it comes to both globalization and the pandemic, although you have at times been called a scaremonger when it comes to the pandemic. But I do find this whole notion of returning to normal a fascinating one, because I think it's a kind of a natural human instinct for one's own personal and community security to want to go back to what it was like, right? And the central thesis of your book is that that is not a helpful notion, because we will then go back to doing precisely the things that caused the pandemic and all the other problems we face, like climate change, the consequences of climate change and so forth. We will continue doing the same things. So the message seems to be getting through to people that it's not going to be the old normal, that it is going to be a new normal, but nobody quite knows what that new normal is going to look like. And as perhaps a fairly mundane example is that in our work practices and our work habits, we got used to doing everything on Zoom, and some of us still are. Now we are going back to the office in some cases 2 or 3 days a week, and it looks as though that might become a kind of a new normal. You don't go back to 5 days a week, and that you do continue to use Zoom and hybrid Zoom and physical events, which of course through Zoom gives you a much wider reach to expert voices around the world. What is your sense then about what this new normal is going to look like in terms of, let's start with the workplace and then tackle some other issues?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to point to the yearning that we all have after, terrible pandemic and the awful suffering that so many people have gone through, is to return to some level of normality, by which we often mean, let's just be able to go to dinner with our friends. Let's be able to do a bit of travel. Let's be able to hug people. Let's be able to do those things. And there's nothing in the book that suggests that we shouldn't do any of that, But if we want to do that in the future, we have to change some other things. And what I take great comfort from is when you think about how different the world is now from January 2020, many things that would have been regarded as absolutely impossible in January 2020 are now normal. I mean, look at the role of governments, the level of quantitative easing, the intervention of governments in labor markets, including to support workers who are unemployed, or in businesses to decide which firms go bankrupt, or not all of it good, like the interventions in procurement policies, but government and telling us things. If you had said in January 2020, government's going to tell us that we aren't allowed to leave our homes, we would have thought that, even in North Korea, that doesn't happen. But we accept it because it's in the common interest. We understand, or the overwhelming majority of people do, that we are prepared to radically change our view of government and our own behavior. The behaviors that the behavior change that we've all done as individuals would have been unimaginable in 2020 January. So the new normal is now accepting we all have digested that we can do things differently. And so when it comes to climate change, for example, no one can say that we can't change our behavior. It's a question of, are we prepared to? Are we prepared to do things differently or in other ways? And we've seen it as well in levels of solidarity, checking up on neighbors, on community organizations, and I could go on and on about the things that people have done which would not have happened before the pandemic. Going forward, I think a lot of this is going to stick. And what the pandemic has done is basically accelerate time. So it's compressed into the period of 2 years, things that would have taken 10 or 20 years to come. It's also dislodged equilibrium. Going to work in a rush hour and coming home in a crowded commuting car or train or whatever commuting one does was an equilibrium that no one could break. Now it's broken permanently. No one is going to expect their workers to pitch up at 9 and leave the office at 5 in the same way, 5 days a week. And that's a wonderful thing. It'll lead to less congestion on the roads and more flexibility in people's lives, etc. We must be sympathetic to the fact that this is highly income and job differentiated. And one of the reasons the pandemic increased inequality in health and in incomes was some people don't have that optionality. You know, if you're a nurse, you're going to pitch up at the hospital at the right time. Or if you're collecting garbage, you're not going to say, well, I think I'll come in a bit later, or a post person. You're not going to, or a fire person. You don't have that flexibility. And so it is exacerbating differences in professions. But for many of us, yes, and it's going to change the nature of offices. I think there's going to be a massive decline in old offices, which are not fit for 21st century. So either in environmental terms or in terms of space, air circulation, etc., a refurbishment of many offices. And we're seeing it in property markets and commercial space. There's huge differentiation now. But, you know, there's a lot of new investment in offices, and those that say offices are dead just haven't seen what's going on in the office market. At the same time, there's a lot of empty offices and a lot of collapse. And I think that'll be reflected. So I think it'll be a big improvement in our lives for many people that were used to the old thing.
Yeah, so then presumably more communal space working, and therefore more networking between people, and therefore more creative ideas, and hopefully some more creative solutions to the huge challenges that face us. You mentioned that the intervention of governments and governments entering the civic space has been one of the outcomes, purportedly for our own safety and benefit. But there've been a lot of pushback to the degree of intervention by government. We've seen it here in the UK. We've seen it in South Africa, where the kind of autocratic tendencies within governments have sort of flourished. And here in the UK, it was quite clear that in order to save his own skin, Boris Johnson had to go way beyond what the scientists were saying when it came to lifting the restrictions, or face the wrath of his own backbenchers and members of the Conservative Party. So it hasn't been, and then you've had the phenomenon of, to be fair, you had the phenomenon already before the pandemic of increasingly autocratic leaders coming into power. Trump in the US and many other examples in Europe, in Poland and Hungary and so forth. So what is the lesson to be learned there? And to take it one step further, as you mentioned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I was going to raise, it doesn't seem as though humanity has learned the lessons of starting and engaging in senseless wars, which end up in the deaths of thousands of innocent people.
Yeah, there's so much in what you're saying, but all crises exacerbate inequality and they undermine democracy. So that's one of the reasons, and I've argued in his previous books, why you want to manage and reduce crises, because poor people always suffer first and worst, and because it gives government strength and undermines grassroots organizations typically. So, and that certainly happened with the pandemic. Whether it's permanent or not, we're going to see. I think what we're seeing in Europe now, for example, is a lot of pushback. And although one might severely dislike what's going on in the politics of the US at the moment, and I certainly am very concerned about US politics, the old structure of the parties has fragmented in this process of the pandemic. It was happening before, but it's fragmented. And I think it's a reflection of inequality as much as else. I don't think we'd have Brexit in Britain, and I don't think we would have had Trump in the White House had it not been for the financial crisis. These crises have real implications for politics. And particularly when people lose faith in the capacity of their rulers to manage their lives and to save them from crises, to give them jobs, to save their incomes, etc. And so that's what gets played through. And then you get into a vicious circle where you get more protectionist to try and save yourself from crises, but there's no wall high enough that will keep these crises out. And I think that's what we're seeing. It's an interesting question, and I haven't sort of worked this one through in my head as whether we would have had the invasion of Ukraine if it hadn't been for the pandemic. Is the invasion of Ukraine somehow related to the pandemic? And I think in some respects it is, because it was part of a process of the building of a totally different narrative in Russia. The disconnection of Russia, the ending of travel, the isolation of Russia, like other countries, but particularly Russia, because it's such a different system, was reinforced. It's basically been disconnected from the world for the past 2 years. Now, I'm not saying that we wouldn't have had the invasion, but I think it all feeds in to a sense of isolation, a sense of protectionism, and an ability of citizens to really have a very different understanding of where they are in the world and how the world views them, etc. If you're not traveling, if you don't have visitors, if your commerce is increasingly fragmented, then you're on a very downward path. And the polar end of this, I suppose, is North Korea. The difference is that North Korea doesn't have the weapons that Russia has. Yes, I think this is a very separate, and it's one of the reasons I argue in Rescue is you have to take a choice. These crises force you to take a choice. And what we saw in history, again, comparing the first and second, these choices matter. Otherwise, you're in a downward spiral.
Thanks, Ian. Let's come to climate change, which you also obviously raise in your book as being one of the major challenges facing the world, and we saw some sort of rather modest edging towards some kind of consensus at COP26, but falling far short of what is needed to rescue the world from self-destruction in the long term. Do you think? Well, let me ask you, what impact do you think, if this Russian invasion of Ukraine is going to lead to a long-term, drawn-out conflict, which is obviously going to hugely impact food prices, mineral prices, supply chains around the world? Is that going to distract further attention from the pressing issues that need to be dealt with, like climate change and the pandemics and various other challenges that are facing us?
Yes, I think it's disastrous, obviously, for many reasons, not for the poor Ukrainians who are being bombarded and killed. But it's disastrous for the world economy. It's going to lead to higher inflation, higher interest rates, slower growth, and it's going to detract from everything else that's happening at the time. And climate, certainly, stopping the next pandemic, certainly. So yes, it's a huge issue. The big question on climate as well is, are these very high levels of fossil fuel prices, oil, coal now as well, and others, going to lead to more investment? Or is this like the last hurrah? Are we seeing peak prices that we will never see again? And that really depends on how governments interpret this. If they start releasing all the fossil fuel subsidies and giving more fossil fuel subsidies and encouraging it, but if they see this as like a wake-up call, now we really got to get off these fossil fuels because they are an umbilical cord between us and Russia, that would be very positive if it leads to a massive sort of Manhattan Project type of leaping in investments in renewable grid, battery storage, and all of that, which is what has to happen. And that's in the hands of governments. So and also in terms of our behavior changes. So my hope is that the high energy prices don't lead to a recommitment to do more exploration and production. I think, you know, and I don't think anyone is. You'd have to be crazy to put in a big investment in fossil fuels now when we know that by 2050 we should be at net zero.
But do you buy into what's happening between the oil and gas giants and Africa, where they are now agreeing, the two parties, to define gas as a renewable in order to have this bridge between the other fossil fuels and net zero 2050, which now is going to give the oil and gas companies a new lease of life. It seems to me a bit of a schlenter, if I might put it that way.
No, I think, well, gas is a transition fuel. I think we need to recognize that it's going to remain a transition fuel, both for standby capacity when renewable grids aren't able to operate because there's no wind or solar, etc., but also because there are lots of places where it's going to take time for the transition. So I'm all in favor of gas as a transition fuel. It's far less dirty. I think, you know, 30 to 40 to 60%, depending on what applications you're using, they're less than oil, and even greater amounts less than coal. A lot depends on how you pipe it and develop it, and whether you have a lot of methane release and other things. But I think it's legitimate to say, but it needs to be on a fixed horizon. You've got to be investing, saying, this is a transition fuel, we're going to go down the curve, and we're going to be at zero, 2050, or before. So, you know, and there's a lot of fantastical thinking, not only from oil and gas companies, but across the board. If you look at the banks, the finance houses, the car producers, virtually everyone is saying, yes, we'll get to 2050, but meanwhile, there's no credible plan to do it. And it means at least halving production by 2030. 2030 is 7 years away, 8 years away. I mean, unless you've got a credible plan, it's like what you're going to do this year and next year, you're not on a path. And that's where I think there's a big lot of greenwashing and disconnect between what people are saying and what needs to happen.
Yes, thanks for that. That is useful, I think, in terms of the in terms of the role of gas as a bridge. But of course, as you say, within a fixed time frame. Otherwise, we're, you know, net zero 2050 is going to become net zero 2075, and so on and so forth. Where does, just to switch to another topic, where does artificial intelligence go after the pandemic, and how has it been affected by the pandemic? Has it accelerated the process of research and producing? I mean, we talk about artificial intelligence as though it's something in the future. In the meantime, our lives are increasingly run by algorithms. So, so that's a bit of a paradox. But what is the relationship between pandemic and artificial intelligence?
Well, I think the pandemic, as I mentioned, has accelerated many things, not least science. So broadly, obviously, we're seeing it in pharmaceuticals. The development of vaccines in the space of a year would have been impossible before, I think. So we're seeing it, and that's assisted by AI, so it's part of the process. We are seeing it in many other areas, and there's definitely been a very positive feedback loop within the AI world, because AI and machine learning are now developing even more superior. So there's a massive increase. Of course, there's also been a technology bonanza. You know, Jeff Bezos doubled his income. Google's income has gone up fantastically. In fact, the billionaires and the stock markets around technology reflect it's not only the tech billionaires getting a lot richer, which they clearly have, but there's a lot of money being recycled back. So if you look at the venture funds in Silicon Valley, even in the UK or in China, you see this huge supply push of money looking for actions. And I think it's going to lead both in areas of medical science around genomics and others. I think we're seeing it in energy, around fusion and other areas, and in AI. If you look at the activities of DeepMind, for example, in the UK, huge doubling down on investment. Some of this is filtering through already into products and services, but I think we're just at the very bottom of this curve in terms of what we're going to see. A big area of focus, and I have a group in Oxford, one of my 3 groups works on this, is what it means for jobs, particularly what it means for repetitive rules-based tasks, which will be replaced by automated processes, call centers, forget about that in the future, manufacturing, and of course, the big question, not least for a group, Chamber of Commerce based in South Africa, is what happens to the middle rungs on the development ladder. There's no East Asian or other model of development on the table anymore. That's all automated away. And so the question is, where will livelihoods be created? What are the jobs of the future? And they're going to be very, very different, not only because of AI, technological change, robotics, automation, etc., but also because of the other compounding forces. Climate change is reducing the rural options, etc. So we're in a different world, and sort of one of the pleasures of being in Oxford is I can get very smart people to think about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd really like you to tap your smart people on the following question. It's a very simple question, really. Is the pandemic really running out of steam? Does a virus ever die? We're told by the scientists that the Spanish flu back in 1918 that virus is still alive, but it's not potent, so it doesn't do much harm, or maybe it causes common colds and stuff. So is this virus petering out, and why are we continually told the next one is going to be worse? Who knows that, and why?
You know, I'm an economist, so put a big caveat on any answer. But what my smart colleagues tell me is that this virus will be around. As far as we know, it's petering out, but the next virus is around the corner. No one can say it's going to be worse. That's the butterfly defect. More people, more compressed, near more airports, near more animals, near more slums. This is a petri dish to create not only something new more frequently, but let it travel more frequently. Anything can be anywhere in the world 36 hours now, basically. And that's different to in history. So it's that compression of people, animals, encroachment onto the wild. And that's if you're only focusing on natural evolution of pandemics. The big new thing happening, and there's some controversy as to whether COVID-19 has that origin or not, is actually manufactured pandemics in a lab, either by crazy people
or accidents,
or by accidents. Yeah. So you know the sources of pandemic are multiplying. Now, on the other side, there's also the surveillance, etc. But that's evolving at an evolutionary speed, and global governance is totally unfit. The World Health Organization has a smaller budget than the hospital up the road from me in Oxford. It has a smaller budget than one warship. You know, and yet any intelligence agency will tell you the risk of dying from a pandemic is thousands of times greater than a global military conflict. This disproportionality of the sources and the response is the reason that unless we do things differently, it's inevitable we will have more pandemics. And I'm not saying the next one will be worse, but there will be a worse one in the future. And that is clear. We don't know when.
So in this,
lots of questions here, John.
Sorry, yeah.
We're getting friends, and it's nice to know that they're on the call.
We're getting on the questions now. Just while I'm going through the questions, if I could just ask you to talk a little bit about what can ordinary people do in order to make things better in what seems like this incredibly sort of hostile and increasingly frightening world. What can we do?
Well, I think what the pandemic has really highlighted is, and again, the Second World War, if you live in a democracy, which I think most of the people on this call do, one has optionality. So you push for the political processes that you believe will enhance it. Get governments to focus on risk protection, on inequality, on climate as big issues. Play your role nationally, but also the country, South Africa needs to play, or Britain needs to play its role globally in these debates. And that's where it gets worked out. We are the owners, our countries are the owners of these institutions. The World Health Organization or the World Bank or any of these United Nations, they're not out there as if they're some foreign organization. They're ours. We are the shareholders. It's like a corporate board that you sit on, and it is what you make it. To just sort of say or blame it for its failures is to completely absolve oneself of responsibility as a country. So one needs to take responsibility. I think so. There's that. I think, you know, spreading good information and countering bad information, whether it's on anti-vax or vaccines or whether it's in other areas. And the Business for South Africa group in South Africa has done an extraordinarily positive job in this around the pandemic. Business mobilizing, and we've seen with that, has done things that have been hugely significant and complementary to government. So business has really discovered itself in South Africa in a very positive way. How that is sustained, in what way it's sustained and taken forward is very important. So there's sort of multiple dimensions. The other thing that has clearly come out of the pandemic is that communities have been devastated, whether it's in the UK, where over a third of the clubs and community centres have been closed down, or in South Africa. And then mental health is a massive issue. Yeah. You see the pandemic has both exposed because people talk about it now, but also exacerbated because it has got worse because of the pandemic mental health issues. Yeah. Acknowledging it, talking about it, and pushing for the sorts of support structures we need in society is vital.
Let's get on to some questions from the audience. There's one here from Miles Wickstead, who says that the Sustainable Development Goals, which you mentioned in your introductory remarks, are you optimistic that they can get back on track?
Hi, Miles. Long time no see. I think the SDGs are seriously derailed. They can be put back on track, but it's going to require a massive intervention, mainly by the rich countries. It's going to have to include a debt write-off, because over 50 countries now have at their fiscal limits. They can't invest. They've been maxed out by spending on health, and of course their economies have collapsed through loss of tourism revenues, loss of other revenues, and so without a debt write-off, for many countries there's no way. That's not going to be enough. There's going to have to be very, very significant increases in solidarity globally. We've seen a dismal failure on this when it comes to vaccines. Less than 11% of Africans are double vaccinated now. It's partly a supply question, but there's also a need for cold chain, for other sorts of interventions. And of course, there's going to have to be a doubling down by governments. I think we've been talking about how distracted people are by the pandemic. All the attention, does governments have the attention span to? The SDGs are so wide-ranging The World Bank estimates that 140 million more people have been pushed into absolute poverty by the pandemic. There was huge progress on extreme poverty. That's been set back, and there's a very wide range of interventions that need to be undertaken. It can happen, but it's going to require a real big focus, big push in the UN and beyond in order for that to happen, starting with the G7 and G20, and I'm not seeing it.
Thanks for that, Ian. There's a question from Merle Lipton, who is saying that you have touched on the vital issue of inequality and stressed the importance of that. What are the means and trends in relation to taxing those super rich who evade taxes, partly by use of tax havens?
Yeah, great to connect with you again, Mo. It's a massive issue. One of the downsides, one of the systemic risks arising from globalization has been tax arbitrage. Many corporates, many individuals are basically relocating to minimal, if any, tax places, whether it's Cayman or elsewhere. That needs to be closed. The OECD BEPS process has been helpful in this regard, still too low at 12%, the minimum levels, but there needs to be a very rigorous enforcement of this globally for individuals and for corporates, and the raising of the threshold. Countries like Ireland are going to have to step up to the plate and be part of this. What the Second World War experience also teaches us is that the notion that people won't pay higher taxes is completely ideological. The tax levels in the US in the 50s and 60s were over 70%, and it's what people think of as the golden age of capitalism, the 30 glorieuses in France, the 30 glorious years. That was a period of massively high taxes, and it had the highest growth rates, productivity growth rates, and others. It was only the Thatcher-Reagan revolution in the 70s and 80s that led to the cutting of taxes by 70%. We need to recover. I'm not saying go back to the levels of the post-war period, but there needs to be an understanding that we cannot resolve any of the world's problems, any of our societal problems, without the rich making a big contribution. The fact that the rich have done so well out of the pandemic, and that inequality is being so greatly increased by the pandemic, does, I think, really focus on it. And I think the tolerance for this is really coming to an end, and we're seeing it in movements around the world, and we're seeing it even in the OECD.
Thanks, Ian. We've got a question here, it's quite a long one, from Njeri Mwagiru. It's about vaccine nationalism diplomacy, which he says has largely shaped vaccine distribution globally, with the national and corporate interests largely informing motivations for vaccine donation. So the question is, to what extent do you think that crises, as opposed to opportunities for solidarity, may instead polarize further, especially the use of crisis by power interests to mobilize for self-interest rather than collective benefits?
Thanks, Njeri. This is a very tough question. Crises can do either. What we've seen, as I indicated, I think the financial crisis leading to the polarization of the UK and the US, leading to Brexit and President Trump, they break cohesion in societies if societies feel that their governments are not defending their interests and have let the crises happen, and they're much worse off as a result. That's why we get this polarization of politics. And it's terribly sad to see the collapse of solidarity on vaccines. It was a condition of our vaccine in Oxford, the AstraZeneca one, that it be open source and that AstraZeneca charge cost for the vaccine. And that's happened. The academics insist on it as part of their deal with AstraZeneca to manufacture it, but the Pfizer and other vaccines have come to dominate for reasons we don't need to go into now. that's one part of it. The COVAX institution got much too little money too late. And now what we're discovering, of course, is that the vaccine supply is there, but the uptake is very differential. And I think people are feeling they don't need the vaccines anymore. There's a lot of fake news, and there's a lot of other problems, including on the cold chain and distribution of some of these vaccines, which need to be stored at very, very severely cold temperatures. So there's many factors in this, but it's been a dismal failure and very sad one. And I think part of the ambition for reforming the world health system to be prepared for the next pandemic has to be manufacturing capability in Africa of a massive scale, and an intellectual property regime that allows immediate transfer to that as well. It's also going to have to be a system of information spreading, which allows people to be confident that you have to take vaccines. Obviously, that's also a battle that's still to be won in many countries.
Thanks, Ian. Tanya Verdonk is taking us back to Vladimir Putin. She says history is littered with people like Putin rising to the top. How do we stop this cycle? And is it a problem or a result to some extent of inequality that these kind of people are becoming more rather than less frequent?
Yeah, history is riddled with them, and it's not only a problem of autocracy. One of the things I highlight in Rescue is that the democracies, many of them have had worse leaders than the autocracies. You know, you look at Trump, you look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, you look at Erdogan in Turkey. These are democracies. Of course, there's some very great successes as well. You look at Boris Johnson in the UK. So there's been a very mixed story around this of individuals and their power enhanced during times of crises. What does one do about it? I think that it is a result of inequality. I think it's this polarization of politics that has exacerbated. I think a lot of people feel that the old systems, the old parties don't stand up for their interests, haven't protected them. And when you look at the data, it's true. You know, wages have stagnated in the UK and the US. People are poorer than they were 30 years ago. And the bottom income deciles and percentile and 20%. And so people aren't imagining that they're not being defended by the governments. It's their lived experience. And so that's the challenge. Now, Russia has a particular set of challenges related to demographic collapse and many other things, which Putin is playing into. But it is, and I think creating more solidarity in societies and more equal societies is a necessary condition for creating a consensus around leadership, and particularly moderation around leadership.
Thanks, Ian. A last question before we have to wrap, unfortunately, due to time. And if you could keep the answer very short, although it's a very big subject, and that is the issue of nuclear, blessing or curse?
Both. I don't think you want to have old school nuclear from the 1950s technology or 1960s technology, which is what many countries are saddled with. But I think new nuclear, pebble bed, micronuclear, new reactors are extraordinary. I think we could get into a world where we mass produce small micro reactors which have no contamination or weaponization potential, like nuclear. And I think, and fusion obviously is a form of this. So to discard nuclear as an option, particularly for base load power, because renewables are intermittent, I think is a big mistake. Having said that, you really want to be careful which nuclear you're embracing, because there's some terrible nuclear, and you wouldn't want to be embracing that. And certainly I wouldn't take 1950s or 60s Russian technology.
Thank you very much, Ian. And And thank you you've taken everything that we've thrown at you and not only come back at us, but actually given us great insight into these very complex issues, given your extraordinary experience in this field. So we really do value your time. The viewers might be interested to know that Ian is speaking to us from Cape Town, South Africa, where he's on a 3-month sabbatical at Stellenbosch University. Lucky man. Thanks so much, and thanks to everybody for joining. I think we got in almost all the questions, and it's been a tremendously enlightening, and it just remains for me to urge you all to buy Ian's book, or buy it and read it, or buy it and give it to somebody else as a present after you've read it. That is Rescue Global Crisis to a Better World. Ian, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks to everyone. I'm sorry I didn't get to all the questions. I wish you all good health, and I hope that you enjoy the book if you do look at it. And I'm always happy to engage. Twitter's Ian_Goldin. You can message me on that.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks so much, John. And thanks to the South African Chamber of Commerce.
Thanks very much. All the best. Bye for now.
Bye.